Well, we all know about the sinking of the Titanic, but did you know Mother Nature played a hand in the unsinkable ship's demise?
On tomorrow's anniversary of the ship's sinking, meteorologist Kyle Eck discusses Titanic, the science behind the disaster.
During the early morning hours of April 15, 1912, Titanic became the most famous ship in history as it sank 2.5 miles to the bottom of the Atlantic. One of its passengers, Margaret Tobin Brown, was born right here in Hannibal, Missouri. She'd been traveling back from France to the States in order to see some family. However, she would unknowingly become one of the main heroines in the ship's disaster.
She was saying we need to get the lifeboat away from the suction that could be caused when this thing goes down. And she knew that it would also help everybody keep warm if they were active.
Staying warm the night of the sinking was key for passengers as temperatures fell to near freezing. That being said, unassuming forces played a role in Titanic's demise: astronomy and Mother Nature. When looking at NOAA weather reanalysis plot data for the evening of April 14, 1912, in the far northwest Atlantic Ocean at around 9 o'clock local time, the location of Titanic just shy of 50 degrees west and 42 degrees north. In terms of atmospheric pressure, you see these deep oranges and reds that indicates areas of high pressure, which goes ahead to support the notion for clear skies. In addition, when we go ahead and look at NOAA weather reanalysis plot data of wind, in areas close to the Titanic sank, if you look closely, these greens and light blue shaded region indicate very light winds, supporting notion of a flat, calm sea. Now, to go along with that, it was a very cold night as well. There were temperature reports near and just above freezing as early as 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening. At around the same location the Titanic struck the iceberg and eventually sank, again at around 9 o'clock local time, a few hours shy of the sinking, the temperatures were in the middle to upper 30s, again according to NOAA weather reanalysis plot data of temperature. Now, putting all of that together with high pressure and light winds, you tend to get what's called radiational cooling. So basically whatever sunlight happened across the sea surface earlier that day was easily able to escape back out into the atmosphere, allowing for cooler air down near the sea surface. In addition, with ice present, this was exacerbated even more to create what's called a superior mirage. To get more insight on that, I spoke with meteorologist and weather historian Sean Potter.
Mirage. This is an optical illusion where objects appear higher above the horizon than they actually are, and the horizon itself can appear raised. So the result of this is that the mirage created a hazy layer on the horizon, potentially making it difficult for the lookouts to spot the iceberg.
With a superior mirage in place, a false horizon would have masked the iceberg. While it's widely known that an iceberg sank the Titanic, it's not as if there was one lone iceberg in the vast sea that night. There were dozens, if not hundreds.
One report, at least from the vicinity of where Titanic was struck, indicated an ice field that was a few hundred feet wide and 15 miles long.
This means that with clear skies, Titanic's lookout crew would have had no problem seeing an iceberg well in advance. There's just two problems. The pair of binoculars from the lookout station was removed before Titanic left Southampton, England, and the moon, in waning crescent phase, just wasn't visible the night of April 14th.
One thing that's worth noting is that in the pre-dawn hours of April 15, there was a survivor, Lawrence Beasley, who described the thinnest, palest of moons rising over the ocean to the east.
Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 at night on April 14th and sank nearly 3 hours later at 2:20 in the morning on the 15th. According to Orth.com, around 400 miles from Titanic's wreckage in St. John's, Newfoundland, a waning crescent moon rose at 5:39 in the morning on April 15th. That left the stars in the sky as the only light source for Titanic. However, if a waning crescent moon were in the sky that night, it would have been able to be considerably brighter than some of the brightest stars in the night sky. To put things into perspective, the brightness of celestial objects can be measured on what's called a stellar magnitude scale. The scale is logarithmic, and brighter objects have a lower magnitude, with fainter objects a higher one.
The brightest stars, like Sirius, have a magnitude of only about minus 1.46. Wow. So a waning crescent moon would have a magnitude of about -6, which, while much less than that of a full moon, is still slightly brighter than the brightest star visible in the night sky.
A waning crescent moon may have been able to shine enough light on the horizon the night of the sinking. While Hannibal native Margaret Brown survived the disaster, the combination of astronomy and eerily calm conditions came together to claim more than 1,500 lives and render Titanic's maiden voyage the most famous shipwreck in history. For WGEM News, I'm meteorologist Kyle Eck.
And as we mentioned, tomorrow, April 15th, is the 113th anniversary of the Titanic sinking.